the UK's tax burden hits a post-war high.
Small businesses say they're drowning in red tape.
Ministers claim they're pro-enterprise.
But more founders are moving abroad.
Rising costs, sluggish approvals.
And now, a growing question.
Is the British dream already broken?
Britain is at a crossroads. Taxes are the highest in a generation. Public services are crumbling and growth has flatlined. But what if it didn't have to be this way? What if we could look across the Atlantic to the country that has outpaced Europe because it has created a political culture that celebrates enterprise and personal ambition? So we came to Washington to find out what Britain is missing and how we can change the narrative.
This series is brought to you by the Institute of Economic Affairs in partnership with the Land of Opportunity.
What is it that makes Americans tick? We came to speak to Signal Polling, a leading polling company. What do they think about taxes? What do they think about excessive regulations? What do they think about entrepreneurs? What do they think about the competitiveness state to state? And perhaps most importantly, what do they think about us and our relationship with Europe? What do they think about the failed EU economic model of centralisation?
Well, Alex, you are Director of Policy here, and you describe yourself as a right-leaning polling company. You don't actually have that in the UK. You don't have any partisan polling companies. So could you just explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So in the United States, if you're a Republican polling company or a Democratic polling company, then you only ever work for Republicans or Democrats. There are some exceptions to that. I think RFK Jr.'s pollster, as RFK himself is a little bit independent, they're a little bit independent. And so they will work for people on both sides. But if you're in the room with candidates when big decisions are being made, then that's a position of a lot of trust. And if you're going to take your ball and go play with the other team in the next cycle, then your future clients are going to question and second guess, can they really trust you? Are these conversations really staying inside the room? And that dynamic exists on both sides of the political aisle. And so I know that's unique to a great degree in the United States compared to other countries I've worked in, but it is basically a hard and fast rule here.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to dive straight in with a big question. So we have with the US and the UK a quote special relationship. So I just wondered, what do Americans think of Britain? What do they think of Europe?
That is a big question. And if I were to ask that, I probably wouldn't get very good results in a poll because it is such a big question. But I think something like 30 to 33% of the United States has ancestry that goes back to the UK. And so there's partisan politics, but there's other things that transcend that. And the relationship, part of the reason why it's so special is that there's a lot of history, there's a lot of genealogy, there's a lot of back and forth travel, there's companies, there's real relationships there that go beyond the political relationships at the top. And so when I advise clients how to message on certain issues, I'll often tell them, don't make people choose between being a good Republican and being a good Christian, because you might not like what they're going to choose. And in this context, I'd say, Americans, I don't want to put them in a position where they're going to be a good Republican and a good partisan, or a good Democratic partisan, and being a good ally, or being somebody who is fond of the UK or Europe.
What do you think Brits think about America in terms of freedom? Do they think that America is a vastly more pro-freedom country than Britain?
I think they definitely do, because I think they're starting from the perspective that Britain is a place that takes a perspective that they need more control, that they need to exercise, more regulation, more taxes, especially over businesses. The concept of an American dream isn't really spoken about in Britain in the same way. And so I think there probably is quite a bit, especially from people working in the private sector, quite a bit of envy, positive envy towards those in America and the concepts that you've got here, maybe on both sides of the aisle, of freedom from big government, freedom from taxation, freedom from regulation, and supporting that American dream. So I think probably everyone back home and across Europe is somewhat envious of that American dream that's ingrained in the culture here. But in general, it's not just this administration, but in general, the amount of well-qualified people from entrepreneurship or from the corporate sector who come across into government, right? And that's very visible now in the current administration. Contrast that with back home in the UK, where it's almost the polar opposite. So you've got this completely different approach to the experience that comes into government. And I think that actually I and lots of people in business are very envious of that in itself, which I find somewhat interesting that it hasn't really come over to Europe at all.
What do you think Americans believe about their public services? Is there an awareness that when I pay for public services, that's coming out of my pocket, not the government's pocket?
More so. There's some similarity in the government takes its piece and then they do with it what they will. There's a lot more objection to what they decide to spend on. And there's a bigger debate, especially now, over the quality of government services. And so I'm actually curious, are people happy with the quality of services? Do they feel like they're getting what they pay for in the UK? Or is it because this sense of they're paying for it is just divorced from what they're getting, that's not how people think? Is that?
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. If you looked at the evidence, whilst the tax burden at an all-time high at the moment in the UK and public services, highest since World War II, and at the same time as public services being at an all-time low. Yeah. And I definitely think that certain governments play into the narrative that actually the solution is more tax rises.
Oh yeah, and that's not different here.
That's not different here.
There's a narrative that is common, I think, across essentially all government and left governments especially, that more money means more services and that more services are necessarily good. Government should work better. That if we want to build something, we should build something. And that it should not come at a 10 times higher cost than what the private sector could do it for.
Do you think there's an awareness that if you tax a business an extra $100 more, that ultimately trickles down to the consumer?
I do think so, and that it means fewer jobs. That's the way that we primarily think about it in the United States, is that every dollar of tax that you take out of a business is a dollar that it can't invest in building its own capacity and expanding and hiring new people, particularly with small business. I think with bigger business, there's more of an argument about reinvesting into the stock market, although right now that's probably not a very good idea. But this is a question about jobs.
See, Andrew, I think that's interesting, that it's essentially that Americans understand the relationship between high taxation and high tax burden with the consequences of how many people this business can employ. So what do you make of that? Do you think we're heading in the wrong direction entirely and we should be going the American way?
Well, I think that the public did vote somewhat for the American way, because a key plank of the current government's campaign was pro-growth, which is exactly what Alex is talking about. It's only since they've been in government that they've actually made it far harder to employ people and create that growth. So you've got this one, which is this sort of campaign rhetoric, and then you've got the actual action in government. And I think that actually, if you look at the attitudes towards tax and growth in Britain, it might be slightly different, but it's not entirely different from the themes we're seeing here in the States, where you have a migration away from the sort of unproductive, excessive taxation, excessive control, towards jurisdictions that are more favourable and welcoming to people who aspire, who want to get a career promotion or start a business. And in the UK, we've got people fleeing to, I think, primarily Italy, Switzerland, the UAE, and actually Florida. And I think here in America, you've got people fleeing certain states to go to more low tax, welcoming pro-enterprise states. So I think actually there's probably a lot of crossover in terms of the attitudes, but not a lot of crossover with regards to the rhetoric from governments.
Obviously, we know that the government don't create jobs and they don't create growth, businesses do. So how do you think we need to adjust that attitude to make it clear that actually the government is merely a facilitator?
Well, again, I don't know if there's any silver bullet to creating that, but I think that it's very clear that as governments fail to create that growth because they take action that directly contradicts the message, that it will increasingly become clear that that's not the approach that works. And I suspect that all over the world at the moment, we've got incumbents being voted out in favour of the opposition. And that's because of the failure of governments to deliver. Like you said, it's not necessarily anti-government, but it's anti all of the waste, the inefficiency. I think it's partly that the understanding from the public is there. They voted for a pro-growth government, but when they get into power, actually their actions and their instincts are that you can create growth by sitting around the cabinet table and fiddling around top down. And I think contrasting that to where you are in America at the moment, your government seem to instinctively understand that growth comes from the people. It comes from a business as a group of people, that you must, embrace business and support it if you are to create that growth, not penalize it with increasing national insurance and increasing regulation. I think that's the core difference.
You reminded me of I just got back from Dubai a few weeks ago, and the number of cranes that I see there was more than I think any that I've seen in my life. A lot of them were Chinese cranes, but set that aside, that's fine. They are building things at a pace that's incredible. And we did a poll in the Gulf. We did Dubai, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. And one of the questions that we asked in a series is comparing American attitudes to people in the Gulf. It's not necessarily citizens, because it's a lot of expats here. And in some of the countries, it's 80% expats. People coming in to work from elsewhere. People from Britain, people from Australia, people from the region, because there's opportunities there, because the government wants them to come, and because the social contract they have with their people makes that worth it. And they are vibrant havens for building things. And a question that we asked was, do you think that you have more economic opportunities in the next 5 years in your own country or moving abroad? And a majority it's almost the same in the US and in the Gulf, said staying in place. Something like 60% of people, maybe a little bit less, high 50s, saying that they had better opportunities where they were. And that's the test for me, for a lot of countries, is are you better off, especially as a young person, remaining where you are and building a community, building a business, whatever it is that you want to do, or do you need to go leave towards somewhere else that's figuring out how to do it better?
We in Britain, I think, have an interesting attitude towards success. We think that those who are successful have a moral obligation to give back to society. And that's why we have an interesting relationship with tax, because we see it as more of a societal contribution, doing your bit for the greater good, for your public services, for your neighbour. Would you say that aligns with the American view of tax, that it's a contribution, or is it seen as an obstacle?
I think it's very widely seen as an obstacle, even on the left, even among people who want more taxes. It's viewed as something that stops something, that deters behavior, rather than something that encourages it, and that it is a necessary evil, rather than a social obligation. That view is out there, but it's an extreme minority.
What do you make of that, Andrew?
The fascinating thing I find coming here to America is that even your left and right dynamic is very different to either the UK or European left and right dynamic, in that this is a country that really embraces free enterprise. And I know it might be not on brand to hear it, but even it doesn't really matter who's in charge to an extent. Relative to Europe, Democrats or Republicans embrace the idea that it's people who create growth, that the government should serve, that ambition in people to, either improve their lives, or start a business or expand it. Whereas over in Britain, as Abby said, there's a sort of increasing divide at the moment, which is all these people who are leaving the UK and fleeing to either, like I said, UAE or America. Good riddance. We don't need you. But actually, the reality is that creates an incredible shortfall in the tax revenues. And what's really not being reported at the moment is all the wealthy people leaving, but actually all of the future wealthy people who are leaving as well. And it's not just entrepreneurs. There are people working in the medical industry or hospitality who are also choosing to leave. And I think that's got parallels to where you are at the moment with no tax on tips and that type of movement. So I think it's, as I said, it's, at the moment, back in Britain, we've got this calls for radical increases in taxes to fix the problems that have been created by radical increases in taxes.
So this is a part of the reason why I'm confident making those assertions about the American left is because there's certain dynamics that are unique to the country, but they play out in an interesting way that creates more political feedback. And I'll expand on that. So we have a census every 10 years. And that means that each state will get reapportioned. And so states that have grown relative to other states, they'll get more seats in the House of Representatives, more electoral votes, they get more weight in the presidential election. And then states that have not grown as much, that now represent a smaller share of the overall American population, they will reduce. And so that power, that apportionment translates into political power, into buying power, into the resources apportioned by the federal government, and much more than that. California is on track to lose 4 seats by 2030. And in aggregate, blue states controlled by Democrats are going to lose 10. And red states controlled by Republicans will gain 10. Texas and Florida will gain 4 apiece. So that's the majority of it. New York loses 3. Blue states are losing their smartest people who feel high taxed, people who want to have lower housing prices because it's very, very difficult to buy a home or to rent a home in New York City. And if you're a young family, then you could do that in Florida for a whole lot less and you don't pay sales tax for it. And so people are voting with their feet and they have their own political beliefs, but they have to feed their family too. And so that creates some desperation. It has created some desperation.
Alex, would you agree out of interest that there is far more consensus on one issue in America, which is free enterprise, risk-taking, aspiration, and the American dream, regardless of both sides? Is it as polarized as it perhaps is in Britain, where we have consensus in other areas, but actually we've got this polarization when it comes to the left and right?
Yeah.
In America, is that the same, or do you think actually you're far much more on the same page?
We're more on the same page.
Yeah.
The minority that doesn't believe that is loud, but it's probably in the 70th percentile of people who believe in that. If I were to poll it, I don't have a particular poll that comes to mind, but there's ways to ask that I think those would be the results that you get, versus those who think that a deregulatory agenda is always akin to fascism. Like, those people are out there and they're very loud. And so those debates are ongoing right now. But most reasonable people think that free enterprise produces better outcomes for anyone because the barriers to entry are so low. If you're a left-leaning person, you could start a business too. There's nothing partisan about that. And you can start a business serving your own beliefs. You can start an NGO if you want, and you can make money your own way. There's freedom to do that. And so that's a very appealing thing, I think, to people, no matter their political persuasion.
I just wanted to finish off by asking what you think, how would I phrase this? The perception of perceptions are in the US. So in Britain, we are very cautious about revealing our political beliefs, and we often get quite surprise election results. So do you think that Americans are more honest about being polled?
I don't think so. I don't think that honesty is I don't think there's a fundamental difference between how people are politically honest about their beliefs in the US compared to the UK or most places. There are some countries that you'll get very high response rates. And so as a pollster, if I'm trying to contact people, this is really the trouble, is that very few people will respond. And so the ones who do represent a subset of the population that's not reflective of the majority. And so you want to get a sample that is a small microcosm of what everybody thinks. But if you're only getting people who answer who are older, who have time, who aren't at school or at work, or have young children that are demanding of every moment of your day, like my young daughter is, then you're going to get a sample that's reflective of, an older, more educated, wealthier population. And so you can weight depending on that. So if you got a handful of people who are people of color and are younger or working class, then you can magnify them so that they represent, every one of them represents 5 people. But if you get somebody who has eclectic views, then you'll be magnifying those eclectic views. And so it's dangerous and fraught to rely on randomness. You have to understand your electorate. You have to understand what the universe of people that you want to be representing is and who's in that universe. And so at our firm, we don't do probabilistic polling that means that you just take a random sampling. We control and we have an idea for who our sample is going to be in the electorate. And we do that for every country that we're in. And there's also, so that's the first half of my answer. The second half, it's a little shorter, is that there are different ways that you can ask questions more cleverly to elucidate people's responses. If you want to ask people if they support Donald Trump, the racist Nazi, very few people are going to want to say that they support a racist, rapist Nazi. But if you ask them, who do you think your neighbors are voting for? Then it's not about them. Then it's not about their own views, and they face no social sanction for saying, oh, I think my neighbors are all Trump supporters, those people. Well, that's a proxy for what they're probably going to do. And so there's ways that you can get around that, and that's more clever polling. And we've had really prominent polling misses in the country. My firm has done really well. We had a very accurate year last year with a number 5 ranked pollster for accuracy by, not Ezra Klein, I mentioned him earlier, by Nate Silver, and the top for Republican private firms. And that's because we ask these questions really carefully, and we are more interested in accuracy than we are making our people look good. Because if we're wrong, then we're probably not going to get hired next year.
Yeah. So in America, when you do a poll of, say, 5 questions, and this is whether it applies to a private polling company or public polling company, do you have to publish the full questions and results? Or are you allowed to cherry pick which ones you present to the public?
I could publish whatever I want to publish. And I would never do a 5-question poll because I have 10 demographic questions no matter what. Because I want to know why those 5 questions I care about, why those people are answered. And if I only ask 5 questions, then I'm not going to know how the women answered, how the parents answered, how the married people, the union members, how the people who are lower income or higher income answered. And so we ask a lot more because we want to really dig into the why behind those.
That was a really good conversation with Alex from Signal Polling. And I think the 2 issues that came up were that the American dream seems to be an area where there is cross-party political consensus. For all the polarization that exists, this is one area where broadly everyone agrees. And the other bit is that actually his research shows that back in Britain, there is a lot of envy for that political consensus, for that support, not only for entrepreneurs, but for everyone pursuing their individual aspirations.